Dollar diplomacy is the effort of the United States, particularly under President William Howard Taft, to further its aims in Latin America and East Asia through use of its economic power by guaranteeing loans made to foreign countries. The Federal Reserve Act is an act of Congress that created and set up the Federal Reserve System, the central banking system of the United States of America, and granted it the legal authority to issue Federal Reserve notes, now commonly known as the U.S. dollar, and Federal Reserve banknotes as legal tender. The act was signed into law by President Woodrow Wilson. The Zimmermann Telegram, or Zimmermann Note, was a 1917 diplomatic proposal from the German Empire to Mexico to join the Central Powers, in the event of the United States entering World War I on the Allied side. The proposal was intercepted and decoded by British intelligence. Revelation of the contents outraged American public opinion and helped generate support for the United States' declaration of war on Germany in April. John Dewey was an American philosopher, psychologist, and educational reformer whose ideas have been influential in education and social reform. Dewey was an important early developer of the philosophy of pragmatism and one of the founders of functional psychology. He was a major representative of progressive education and liberalism. Although Dewey is known best for his publications concerning education, he also writes about many other topics including experience, nature, art, logic, inquiry, democracy, and ethics. Margaret Higgins Sanger was an American birth control activist, sex educator, and nurse. Sanger popularized the term birth control, opened the first birth control clinic in the United States, and established Planned Parenthood. Sanger's efforts contributed to the landmark U.S. Supreme Court case which legalized contraception in the United States. Sanger is a frequent target of criticism by opponents of birth control and has also been criticized for supporting eugenics, but remains an iconic figure in the American reproductive rights movement. The Kellogg-Briand Pact, or Pact of Paris, officially General Treaty for Reunification of War as an instrument of national policy, was a 1928 international agreement in which signatory states promised not to use war to resolve disputes or conflicts of whatever nature or of whatever origin they may be, which may arise among them. Parties failing to abide by this promise should be denied the benefits furnished by this treaty. It was signed by Germany, France, and the United States on August 27, 1928, and by most other nations soon after. Sponsored by France and the U.S., the pact renounced the use of war and called for the peaceful settlement of disputes. Similar provisions were incorporated into the UN Charter and other treaties, and it became a stepping stone to a more activist American policy. It is named after its authors, United States Secretary of State Frank B. Kellogg and French Foreign Minister Astrid Briand. The Teapot Dome scandal was a bribery incident that took place in the United States from 1920 to 1923 during the administration of President Warren G. Harding. Secretary of the Interior Albert B. Fall released Navy petroleum reserves at Teapot Dome in Wyoming and 2 other locations in California to private oil companies at low rates without competitive bidding. In 1922 and 1923, the leases became the subject of a sensational investigation by Senator Thomas J. Walsh. Fall was later convicted of accepting bribes from the oil companies. Before the Watergate scandal, Teapot Dome was regarded as the greatest and most sensational scandal in the history of American politics. The scandal was also a key factor in posthumously further destroying the public reputation of the Harding administration, which was already unpopular due to its poor handling of the Great Railroad Strike in 1922 and President's veto of the Bonus Bill in 1922. The Dawes Plan was an attempt in 1924 to solve the reparations problem, which had bedeviled international politics following World War I. The Allies' occupation of the Ruhr industrial area contributed to the hyperinflation crisis in Germany. The plan provided for their leaving the Ruhr and a staggered payment plan for Germany's payment of war reparations. Because the plan resolved a serious international crisis, Dawes shared the Nobel Peace Prize in 1925 for his work. It was an interim measure and proved unworkable. The Young Plan was adopted in 1929 to replace it. The Tariff Act of 1930, otherwise known as the Smoot-Hawley Tariff or Hawley-Smoot Tariff, was an act sponsored by Senator Reed Smoot and Representative Willis C. Hawley and signed into law on June 17, 1930. That raised U.S. tariffs on over 20,000 imported goods to record levels. The overall level of tariffs under the act were the highest in the U.S. in 100 years, exceeded by a small margin by the tariff of 1828. The act and the ensuing regulatory tariffs by U.S. trading partners reduced American exports and imports by more than half. Economists agree that the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act increased the severity of the Great Depression. The National Recovery Administration was the primary New Deal agency established by U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1933. The goal was to eliminate cutthroat competition by bringing industry, labor, and government together to create codes of fair practices and set prices. The NRA was created by the National Industrial Recovery Act and allowed industries to get together and write codes of fair competition. The codes were indeed intended to reduce destructive competition and to help workers by setting minimum wages and maximum weekly hours, as well as minimum prices at which products could be sold. The NRA also had a 2-year renewal charter and was set to expend in June 1935, not renewed. The Glass-Steagall Act is a term often applied to the entire Banking Act of 1933 after its congressional sponsors, Senator Carter Glass, Democrat of Virginia, and Representative Henry B. Steagall, Democrat of Alabama. The term Glass-Steagall Act, however, is most often used to refer to 4 provisions of the Banking Act of 1933 that limited commercial bank security activities and affiliations between commercial banks and security firms. This article deals with the limited meaning of the Glass-Steagall Act. A separate article describes the entire Banking Act of 1933. The Agricultural Adjustment Act was a United States federal law of the New Deal era which restricted agricultural production by paying farmers subsidies not to plant on part of their land and kill off excess livestock. Its purpose was to reduce crop surplus and therefore effectively raise the value of crops. The money for these subsidies was generally generated through an exclusive tax on companies which processed farm goods. That created a new agency, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, to oversee the distribution of these subsidies. The Agricultural Marketing Act, which established the Federal Farm Board in 1929, was seen as a strong precursor to this act. United States Congress enacted the Securities Act of 1933 in the aftermath of the stock market crash of 1929 and during the ensuing Great Depression. Legislated pursuant to the Interstate Commerce Clause of the Constitution, it requires that any offer or sale of securities using the means and instrumentalities of interstate commerce be registered with the SEC pursuant to the 1933 Act, unless an exemption from registration exists under the law. Means and instrumentalities of interstate commerce is extremely broad, and it is virtually impossible to avoid the operation of this statute by attempting to offer or sell a security without using an instrumentality of interstate commerce. Any use of a telephone, for example, or the mails would probably be enough to subject to transaction to a statute. The U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission is a federal agency. It holds primary responsibility for enforcing the federal security laws and regulating the securities industry, the nation's stocks and options exchanges, and other electronic security markets in the United States. The Reciprocal Tariff Act provided for the negotiation of tariff agreements between the United States and separate nations, particularly Latin American countries. The act served as an institutional reform intended to authorize the president to negotiate with foreign nations to reduce tariffs in return for reciprocal reductions in tariffs in the United States. It resulted in a reduction of duties. Lend-Lease was the law that started a program under which the United States of America supplied the United Kingdom, the USSR, Republic of China, Free France, and other allied nations with material between 1941 and 1945. It was signed into law on March 11, 1941, a year and a half after the outbreak of World War II in Europe in September 1939. This was 9 months before the U.S. entered the war in December 1941. Formerly titled An Act to Further Promote the Defense of the United States, the act effectively ended the United States' pretense of neutrality.